Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Rod Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2019 movie titled Tolkien. Now, Tolkien runs for 1 hour and 52 minutes long. It is directed by Dome Kaukowski. It is produced by Peter Chernin, Jenno Topping, David Reddy, Chris Teichier. The script was written by David Gleason and Stephen Beresford. The score was done by Thomas Newman. The cinematography by Lassie Frank. And it was edited by Harry Yulonian. And the stars of the movie are Nicholas Hoult, Harry Gilby, Lily Collins, Mimi Keene, Colm Meany, Derek Jacobi, Anthony Boyle, Adam Brigman, Patrick Gibson, Albie Marber, Tom Glynn-Carney, Ty Tennant, Craig Roberts, Pam Ferris, James McCallum, Guillermo Bedward, Laura Donnelly, Genevieve O'Reilly, and Owen Teale. Even if you've never picked up a book based off of his Middle-earth series, J.R.R. Tolkien is a familiar name that rests in the annals of literary geniuses like Lewis Carroll, C.S. Lewis, and Mark Twain. But very little is known about the author and what events influenced him to write one of the greatest fantasy stories ever created. Under the direction of Dome Kaukowski from Fox Searchlight, we embark on a journey to the early years of J.R.R. Tolkien to get some insight of his early life and the trials and tribulations that come with it that inspired him to write his fantasy stories that has encouraged others to follow his footsteps in imagination and creativity. In many ways, this movie kind of almost reminds me a bit like the 2004 not necessarily a biopic drama, but a period piece drama titled, if you may have remembered, Finding Neverland. You know, with Johnny Depp, Kate Winslet, Dustin Hoffman in his second Peter Pan themed type movie. No, don't worry, he wasn't putting on Captain Hook or anything like that. Julie Christie, you know, it's about how J.M. Barrie. I'm not going to go too much into Finding Neverland because I'm talking about Tolkien here, so I'm going to make this as quick as possible. About how, you know, J.M. Barrie had a series of events that inspired him to write his iconic play musical fantasy Peter Pan. Well, this movie is almost in some way very similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's early life, the tragedies that he had to endure, the people who he had met, and anything that inspired him to write some of his many memorable, iconic pieces. Namely, of course, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. You know, those were his famous pieces. So, you know, Tolkien is using these events as a catalyst for his brilliant creative works that has been an inspiration to people all over, in hopes that with tragedy you can make light of it by using your imagination to sort of overcome whatever stuff that's grieving you, and hopes that you can find some happiness in the world of imagination as kind of a way to overcome your griefs and anxieties. And I think this movie does a very fine job of exemplifying that. The early years of Tolkien's life, like everyone else in this world, has been plagued with its fair share of ups and downs, and he's had quite a few tragedies in his early life. And I'm sure it probably also materialized in his later life, but his early life is definitely filled with sadness and grief. However, what stands out from Tolkien's perspectives is that he could take whatever troubling moments he had encountered and transform it into something creative and adventurous. The successes and the hardships of his life can almost have similar visions of a painter looking for his or her muse. And sure, this is not a lost chapter of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. It's a biopic after all, so I ask you, will the intended audience be interested in the man behind the works, or are they expected to see the iconic characters pop up here and then? Are you expecting to see Frodo or Bilbo make some kind of little cameo appearance? If you're thinking the latter, well, this is not the movie for you. This is about the man behind the myth, as the old saying goes. This is about J.R.R. Tolkien and the stuff that inspired him to create some of the most brilliant pieces in modern writing. When I was young, I was infatuated with adventure and fantasy stories. Though I could never read a bunch of chapters in one day, I would read a chapter and then savor each chapter to get a better understanding of what I read, and I take down notes or details that I found that were important. In 2001, Peter Jackson directed Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and I was one of the many who was excited when it first came out. Then I got to watch the entire trilogy, and I have never looked back since then. In the end, you ask yourselves, how did this movie turn out in the end? All overall, Tolkien is a riveting story that is both visually stunning and the storytelling is superb. It's about life's journeys through love and loss, overcoming the odds, and living another day. What it's not is about a young man fulfilling his dreams, but a man who is oblivious to the hidden talent he never knew he had. He may have had aspirations of wanting to become an English teacher or a literary professor, but the stuff that he had grown up with, from when he was a young boy, his mother would often tell him fantasy stories about ogres and giants and witches and dragons and wizards and good guys and bad guys and stuff like that. Good conquering evil with a bit of a fantasy element to it. And that kind of like materialized in his head. And it took him, like from his home to, growing up in an orphanage to, his fellow group called some kind of like a tea club type of group, some kind of society group that he had, which could probably be an example of his fellowship, his love letters, things like that. And he just managed to take all of these tragic events in his life and transformed it into some of the most brilliant pieces in literary history. And I think he does a really good, serviceable job at that. In his youth, he was sent to an orphanage where he bonded with three other well cultured individuals who would become his fellowship. The four friends would become the Tea Club and Barovian Society. Their bonding was met with intellectual thoughts rather than just casual bonding that most men tend to interact the most. I mean, they weren't talking about the latest scoreboard or, them banging on a hot chick or anything like that. No. They were well cultured individuals. These guys would be mostly just maybe debunking down the latest book by some great playwright. They could be just, dissecting into Shakespeare or Hemingway or Steinbeck or Eugene O'Neill or any other brilliant author, and would just go into details what they wrote, and just dissected it. These guys actually bonded with intellectual stuff rather than just casual stuff. I mean, not to say that talking about the latest scores or who you've been sleeping around with may be something a casual person might find intriguing. But that's not what these young men were about. These young men were mostly talking about stuff to raise the bar on the intellectual scale. And they wouldn't talk these things over. They would talk these things over at a pub with a beer. No, they would be sitting in a cafe sipping some nice tea. Like typical British boys, huh? That's what they represented. Their bonding was met with intellectual thoughts rather than casual. Over time, Tolkien, played by, of course, Nicholas Hoult, eventually meets a fellow boarder named Edith Bratt, played by Lily Collins, who, of course, we all know is the daughter of legendary pop star Phil Collins. And, they would eventually fall in love with each other. And, he would be, and of course, his love letter to her is pretty much the catalyst for his Lord of the Rings, which was typically a love letter to his wife. That's what Lord of the Rings really was. All of a sudden, World War I comes into play, and Tolkien eventually serves his time there, especially during the bloody battles of Somme, where millions of people met their fate. Hell, even a couple of his Tea Club and Bavarian Society fellowship. Not all of them survived in that deadly war either. Or some of them may have came out with the post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, they didn't come out unscathed either. And I'm sure even the psychological scars may have also materialized on the psyche of J.R.R. Tolkien. I mean, we probably wouldn't know it, or maybe we're just transparent about it, but, nonetheless, the tragedy that had affected him would be written back in paper. If there was any real weakness in this movie, it's that Hoult lacks the charisma as the titular character. Now, Mind you, he's still young in this profession. He's still, just, pretty much one of the more younger generations. And I'm sure that later times he'll probably get better, and maybe he has been in better films. But he definitely does lack the charisma as the titular character. Unlike a lot of films where we find the artists struggling with their inner feelings and their anger and passion is driven by their work of art, and though he has experienced heartbreak, he seems quite laid back and lives in his own world filled with imagination and languages which would wind up in his stories. And it's good that he could somehow manage to keep his feelings inside. I mean, okay, he doesn't have to go into over the top melancholy. No, he doesn't. It doesn't have to be that way. Otherwise, it would just be a little awkward and quite absurd. But still, the guy just doesn't have that spark. And I think he needs that, and quite importantly, in if he wants to continue in his acting. He has to develop more feelings, more out there in him. And not to say that he had a bad performance, not by a long shot. No. It's just there was just not enough spark. Maybe I might be asking too much, but a little more emotion would be quite sufficient, wouldn't you say so? I know I. The strong connection between the reality he faced and the fantasy world he created were pretty much absent here. Instead of correlations of the events in his life, will pave a way to the stories he will eventually write. Okay, sometimes it doesn't always intertwine. Like, 1 minute he's in the real world. And then next thing you know, he's in his world of imagination. Which one is it? You can't have both ways now, can you, huh? I didn't think so. But, that's kind of some. These are just some kind of minor quibbles. It didn't ruin the movie in any way, shape, or form. When coming to see the movie, there are a few things to take into consideration. You might not have to know everything about Tolkien's life, but if you read The Lord of the Rings, you might get a better understanding of the world he lives in. I really actually thought that Lily Collins, she was wonderful as Tolkien's lover and slash wife, Edith. She's, of course, the daughter of music legend Phil Collins. I also thought Patrick Gibson also did quite well, too, as his fellowship member Robert Gilson. And so then in the end, for a simplified biopic drama, I was enthralled by the movie in its entirety, even managing to get a little teary-eyed in the end. And sure, some important details of his life were left out. I can understand. It's a movie. It's not a documentary, so there is going to be some artistic licenses that could be a little bit hyperbolic. But it's just a way to just keep us intrigued. Because knowing that we're not watching a documentary, we're not watching a complete biography from his life to his death. No, we're not. We're just looking at the events and the people around him that inspired him to write these classic tales like Lord of the Ships and The Hobbit. And we just grow to adore this individual, and to say that this guy is a trailblazer for people to write more fantasy stories. And how the imagination through these fantasy stories truly bear no limits. This movie really, really, truly was a delight to watch. I thought the acting was very good. I'm not saying it was the best, but the acting was really good. And even though it was a little bit hard on Nicholas Hoult, I still think he pulled off a decent performance. Uh, he's still young in this in the business, so give him some time, and I'm pretty optimistic that we'll probably see him in the future, and he will get better. I guarantee you that. Lily Collins was amazing. I thought she was good. Colm Meany was very good in his supporting role as a priest who was kind of his caretaker. I actually dug veteran screen and theater actor Derek Jacobi as his professor in languages, who they used to communicate in dead languages, particularly Latin, or even just exchanging literary messages to each other. And I thought that also worked out brilliantly. There was some good chemistry there too. I mean, I just kind of wish the characters were a little more larger than life. That's kind of where there's the bit of the red herring. But I think it does work out very well in the end. I do highly recommend people to see this movie. And if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would probably give Tolkien an 8. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules: be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Carrot Rider saying keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.